Hello and welcome back to NewsReal with Joe and Neil.
I'm Joe.
I'm Neil. Today is Sunday, 24th of February. It's been exactly 1 month to the day that President Trump declared the head of the National Assembly in Venezuela to be the legitimate president of...
How long ago? 3 months, you said?
1 month.
1 month.
On the 24th of January, Trump declared a coup d'etat of sorts via Twitter, setting in motion a whole series of things that kind of culminated, I suppose, in yesterday, February 23rd, the launch, I suppose, of an operation to retake Venezuela, in quotes. It's so transparent to us what's going on. We assume also to most of our listeners and our viewers. It's only just kicked off. Where will it go? How bad will it be? We'll try to get a gauge on that. It struck us really that after a month of trying to make it real via declarations, press statements, entreaties to Venezuelan military people to defect, I believe they managed to enlist about 60 people. Yeah, it included a couple of top generals and foreign attaches in Washington and whatnot, but I think the sum total is 60 Venezuelans defected from the government to Washington. That's not going to work on the face of it. And yet they went ahead yesterday with a kind of, well, the Venezuelan government's description, the legitimate one, Maduro's, is that it's a Trojan horse operation, and it's hard not to disagree with that. As far as I know, only so far 2 people have been killed and about 20 injured.
Well, 4 killed.
4 dead now.
Yeah. There were, apart from this stage-managed scene, effectively at the Colombian-Venezuelan border, there's a bridge there, and it had been blocked off. It had been blocked off for quite a while. Anyway, and they just added some reinforcements to it. That there, I think, one maybe humanitarian truck, a truck carrying humanitarian aid supposedly was set on fire. And I mean, the Guardian, and I was just checked the Guardian's report on this, and they tried to claim, I don't know who put this out, but someone claimed, and the Guardian repeated it, as did all the Western news outlets, that the truck was set on fire by tear gas canisters fired by the police.
Venezuelan police from across the border. Yeah,
well, on the bridge or whatever. But last I heard, tear gas canisters generally wouldn't set fire to, a truck. They don't burn,
right, per
se. And you notice, I mean, we know this because looking at the French Yellow Vest protests, they've been going on for 15 weeks now. There's a large quantity of tear gas canisters have been fired there, and what you see in all of the videos of this are the people picking them up and throwing them back. Right. So these aren't incendiary devices. So for the Guardian to say that it would, just to try and pin the blame of the Venezuelan government, effectively, that they're the ones who burned, because that was the whole point of this operation. It was almost like the US has got so bad at staging coups, or they've done it so many times in front of the cameras, that you can now predict what's going to happen.
Right.
And their goal obviously was to, the optics, as they might say, on this was that you had to have humanitarian aid coming from the US, let's say, or from US-sponsored groups trying to get into Venezuela in the form of 2 or 3 trucks, and those trucks had to be set on fire or had to be in somewhere or other destroyed. Therefore, there's a very high chance that these were set on fire by the US / this supposed new leader Guaido's stooges, basically henchmen, right, who just set it on fire.
Yeah, it's key for the optics. You've got right, the convoys represent peace and help and generosity, and then there needs to be violence in juxtaposition to it to show, well, we're the good guys and they're the bad guys.
Yeah.
See?
So there was that at the Colombian Venezuelan border, and then down in the southeast on the Brazilian border, there were clashes there in a town where another kind of aid convoy, small one again, that came from Brazil. Again, organized. Not this is just because it comes from Brazil doesn't mean it's come from the Brazilian government. It's organized by this Guaido guy and his backers in the US, and it got into Venezuela. But then there were clashes between kind of pro and anti-Maduro demonstrators, and there was some gunfire and stuff, and 4 people there were killed, were shot. So that was, I mean, it hasn't really had the effect that they hoped, I think, because I mean, certainly it's been reported in the media, but the media is just reporting it as here's what happened type thing. You're not really getting the flavour of a kind of Ukrainian Maidan situation. You know what I mean? Even the fact that 4 people were killed by effectively unknown shooters or snipers shooting at people from both sides. They don't even know exactly who the people are who were killed, and a few dozen injured. It hasn't really done what I think what they were expecting, unless this is just the first salvo and there's more to come type thing. But they need to go massive on this one. They need to go a lot bigger on this to really achieve what they hope to achieve. And the problem is, I think, that the reality all along that has been denied to Western audiences via Western media reporting on Venezuela is that there simply is not the support for this guy Guaido in Venezuela. The vast majority of the Venezuelan people support Maduro. Yeah. He won an election last year with 67% of the vote, and something like 19 million people voted. So there's just, I mean, unlike other situations where either the population had been worked up and was against the government and could be relied on to get out in the streets in mass in numbers like in Ukraine, particularly in a big city like Kiev, or where the US has direct access to the country and has agents within the country in large number, and even has maybe, military resources within the country and that kind of stuff. So neither of those things apply in Venezuela. So it's extremely difficult, and it's funny to see it just kind of fizzling out like a damp squib because of that. And the only reason it doesn't fizzle out is because in other situations is because they have access. You know what I mean? So it's the extent to which the US can create the reality for the media and on the ground and create the appearance at least, or even create a kind of a coup in a certain sense. Of course, even in Ukraine, it wasn't as the support for a coup was in no way as overwhelming among the political or the ordinary people, the political class or the ordinary people, but they could get it. There was enough there to massage it and to make it kind of grow, if you know what I mean, and to snowball and become something more than it actually was. But in Venezuela, they have very, very little. I
think what you're getting at is, in Ukraine, there was a consistent pattern of discontentment with the status quo.
Right, with the establishment in general, not any one particular party, but
so
both.
There was a cleavage there that was successfully enough, let's say, to make it a coup de facto, because of course the leader fled, and new elections. So de facto it was a success, in quotes. Ukraine has since gone down the tubes, but whatever. We'll knock that up as a success for them. And the similar issue here is that this is where they have some reality on their side. You said that in the election last year, he was, contrary to the blatant lie, he was actually democratically, legitimately, 100%, ticks all the boxes. He was elected president, Maduro. But there is, again, a cleavage. There have been large protests expressing discontent, but that has never, in all the opportunities Venezuelans get, local elections, national elections, presidential elections, and referenda, that has never once translated into widespread popular support for opposition parties, figures, etc., etc. There has though been this basic cleavage of discontentment, and I think that's what excited the regime changers in Washington and elsewhere to go for it now, because it had been roughly 5 or 6 years in the making since the oil price collapsed, since inflation kicked in. The different reasons for that, but primarily I think we have to go with it being foreign currency manipulation from banking cartels, which doesn't absolve Venezuelan leadership of culpability and responsibility for at least how they handled it. I mean, they're very Johnny come lately with introducing alternative payment systems for purchasing products. This is and this is another one of the cleavages. It was probably massively overinflated outside of Venezuela. Nevertheless, it has some reality on the ground. The availability of goods. The availability of goods on the one hand and the availability to pay for them both had some basis in reality. But in fact, there is still to this day there is not an actual starvation crisis issue. There are plenty of resources, but there's a problem with resource allocation. That's probably down to hoarding on the one hand. On the other hand, it's down to how to pay for it. So yes, it is true that there's a serious crisis with the currency.
Yeah.
In the recent months and years, a bit late, they've introduced alternative means of payment within Venezuela, heavily subsidized goods, etc. So there is no actual starvation. It's a lie that they're all starving, therefore they need our help. But there is some cleavage on the ground, and they're hoping, I think, if we just do enough, it'll bite.
No,
but it's not.
But what it'll bite, like what the majority, a significant majority of the Venezuelan people, of Venezuelan adults, the voting population, are going to suddenly decide that they don't no longer support the Bolivarian kind of revolution and the process that has been ongoing for almost 20 years now of direct democracy that was initiated by Chavez, that was designed originally, and here's where you have to understand in the past, I mean, before Chavez came to power, what allowed Chavez to come to power was much worse mismanagement of the financial mismanagement of the country that provoked riots in 1989 in a place that became known as Caracazo, riots in a town called Caracazo, and up to several thousand people were killed in those at that time, with the former kind of president and former government that sent the troops onto the street to put down a riot because of an economic crisis, effectively, that was centered around the Venezuelan government at the time taking an IMF loan. It centered around a fall in oil prices and an increase in the price of oil in Venezuela and an increase in transport costs that caused major riots in 1989 in Venezuela that led to the deaths of up to several thousand people by the state and by exchange of fire, effectively. None of that has happened in Venezuela under Chavez,
or Maduro.
And the thing about the thing that led to those riots was, and the thing that people don't understand, is that the kind of demographics of Venezuela has been for a long time, for a lot of the 20th century, a situation where you have a very large percentage of the population who are kind of like an underclass. They're mestizos, they're mixed, they're of African origin, effectively, or if they're indigenous South Americans. And there's a lot of racism, and has been a lot of racism towards them by the upper classes, basically, the more wealthy class. And they're a very large underclass. And they were basically just, for most of the 20th century, were just kind of left to just do their thing, to be in poverty and stay in poverty. There was no reallocation of resources, whatever, to try and bring them out of poverty. These are talking about millions and millions of people who could not read or write, and the state throughout the 20th century did not bother at all to try and alleviate the poverty, the real poverty that they were living in, and even to give them proper education. So it was those people who, whenever there's an economic crisis, those people who already have very, very little, who are going to be at the forefront of protests. And that's what happened in 1989, and it ultimately led to a coup, or a couple of attempted coups, that involved Chavez, and then eventually him being elected president, and his then understanding, or his process, his long-term process that has extended to today with Maduro, to essentially lift these people, this massive underclass, out of poverty. And under Chavez, a lot of that was very successful. He was successful in doing that. I mean, basically, there's 100% literacy now. Millions and millions of people were taught to read and write, And this is in the last, since the year 2000, basically, you know what I mean? So it's people forget about that and forget that that's obviously a positive thing, and there's no way anybody in their right mind, except for people in Washington, who would claim that that's a bad thing or that's not responsible actions of government. But that's overlooked. None of that backstory is told as to what the Bolivarian, what Chavez's revolution is, and what Maduro is attempting to continue to do. I mean, they may have gone a little bit far with their direct democracy, and although throughout Chavez's era there were referendums, multiple referendums happened where the vote was given on government policy. So government policies, government decision to do A, B, or C was given to the people to vote on, and they all voted on it. So they implemented, like under Chavez, they implemented direct democracy in a very radical way.
Totally. Chavez said, I want to. The reason I'm tinkering over and over with how we run things is that I want government to be the fullest possible expression of the popular will.
Right. I mean, you can argue for and against that. We've talked about populism on other shows in the past and whether or not, it's workable, whether it's a good idea or not. But certainly, I think there's a middle ground there where you would at least not treat the people like you treat them as though you think they're idiots, basically, and dismiss them. You know what I mean? You give them some voice, but I don't think most people actually really want to have that kind of, in most countries, necessarily want to be consulted every time the government wants to pass a piece of policy, or implement a new law. I don't think most people are interested in that. They want to get on with their normal lives. That's why you elect government officials, right, to do that kind of stuff. But so there's a happy medium can be had there where you're not treating them like complete idiots and like you think they're a bunch of, they're a rabble, basically. But so you do listen to what they want. So it's hard to strike that balance, but it can be done. But the problem today is that obviously in Western countries, the governments are doing exactly the opposite. Look at France today, where the Macron government is using all sorts of tactics and slanders and slurs against the protesters in France, ordinary people, and they're talking about direct referendums and direct democracy in France now because of that. So you don't want to go too far in that opposite direction, but you need a responsible government to listen to what the people say, implement some things, do what they're meant to do, which is, after being elected by the people, to implement policies that they know the people actually want, that they know that are going to be good for the people, and people are going to be happy with. At least they're not going to complain about them. Right. But that's not what they're doing. So then you have this swing towards, we demand a government of the people, basically, not a government for the people, but a government essentially of the people. Which, that's fraught with difficulty, and like I said, it's not really in the interest of most ordinary people or most ordinary people aren't interested in actually, being politicians, right? They don't want to have to spend that amount of time and effort to actually, pour through government legislation and decide whether or not it's right or wrong. So,
well, I hear you in theory, but in practice in Venezuela, most people participated.
Right.
If you take that as your benchmark, what was the voter turnout for referenda or elections? Then it was consistently 80+% right the way through into Maduro's first election the year after Chavez died. Although that was an interesting result because Maduro won by a slim margin. But anyway, it carries on. And then a new tactic begins where the opposition calls for boycotting.
Right.
That first began in 2014, I believe. And that's been the consistent practice since then. And that just speaks to, and that has probably drawn out about 30% of those who had been voting, give or take, up to that point, then began to not participate. But you still had a majority. You still had higher results, higher consistent participation than you would in the United States, for example, where only 50% of people who can vote in elections at the national level for the president, the most important one, the most in-your-face one, only half bothered to vote for that. In Venezuela, despite the boycott managing to draw out about a third of those who had been, you're still getting 60+% of people participating. So that again underscores how banal, mendacious, and factually incorrect the claim is that, well, hang on, people are boycotting because they're not interested or because they hate Maduro. It's wrong on both counts. There's still sufficiently there is still a majority in a country like Venezuela after 20 years that has interest.
That wants to be involved. Yeah. I think that's a legacy, and I think obviously what you have to include here in the analysis is the history of the country and the type of country that you're talking about. You know, the type of, you know, its political and economic history, and obviously Venezuela's political and economic history is quite different from certainly most Western European countries over the past 20 or 30 years. You know. So there's a motivation there. There's an interest. There was a political awakening and a motivation by ordinary people who were previously in poverty and illiterate, who now are not so poor and can read and write. They've seen the benefit of. They see that they accrued those benefits as a result of direct democracy. So therefore, they're willing, or they're interested in keeping it going. They think that, you know, it was the will of the people, and it was the institution of direct democracy to one extent or another that allowed these benefits to come to us. Therefore, we need to keep this going. But you compare that to America or Western European countries, where a lot of people, at least up until recently, were very self-satisfied, had everything they wanted, had, you know, there was no real poverty, no need or whatever. That's why you have so much apathy in America today, is because America lives high on the hog, and the vast majority of people in America are very well fed or overfed, and therefore, well, when your belly's full, what interest, and you know it's going to be full tomorrow, what interest do I have in politics?
Isn't it interesting, though, that at this time, maybe we'll still leave the United States out to the side for a moment, but in Western Europe, that people are clamoring for greater participation. 15 weeks now the French have been out there, tear gassed and beaten, and everything that the Maduro government's accused of doing, the Macron's government is actually doing. And they're clamoring for greater participation. And yes, it's partly an economic issue. It's partly a cultural issue. They want serious fundamental change to the way things are done. They're being lied to day in, day out. I suppose what I'm getting at is Westerners have been conditioned thus far, and their default is apathy. But give them a chance, or give them, at this time when they can see more, maybe they're, in terms of a general awakening, access to more information.
It's not.
They seem to be wanting to.
It's not about giving them a chance. It's hit them in their pocketbooks, and that's when they become politically interested. That's when they want direct democracy, and that's why. That's what I was saying previously. That people, the vast majority of people in Venezuela, who are the bulk of the people who support, who supported Chavez and continue to support Maduro, are people who are previously very poor. Yeah. And so that direct democracy lifted them out of poverty and taught them to read and write and give them better jobs. So those people at the time were motivated by their bellies, effectively, by hunger.
And that's increasingly the case in austerity.
In austerity-ridden Western Europe, and that'll continue to happen. You'll see more and more protests. People, I mean, it's an age-old. I mean, it's not like it's rocket science, right? When people are hungry and tired and feeling like, they're not. They have food. There's food scarcity, or there's food insecurity, or just what they previously had, they no longer have. They're being squeezed. They're seeing their privileges reduced. That's when they get political. And by political, I mean they just get in the street and start complaining about the government. Yeah. Of course, there's all sorts of theories and ideas that they have, and different. I mean, if you look at the yellow vests, you could pick one person and he'd give you a long discourse on the evils of capitalism and the virtues of socialism, and
or not all of them are like that,
or in the other direction. But then you could pick someone else and they wouldn't have much of a word to say about that at all. They just say, "I don't like Macron.
Yeah,
he's,
Yeah, or I want my country back.
Yeah, I just don't like the way he's
I don't want, for example, this week in France, they've announced that they're going to introduce the European Union flag in every classroom in the country. Right. What a time to introduce that. I mean, the French are like, no. But they're carrying on with an agenda. It has its own motion, they're just, whatever, we'll carry on. But that's the other aspect of, you're right. I think it will be the primary driver, food, resources. And also, don't forget, psychologically, they've shown that a sense of fairness is important. Even if, say, the minimal wages / government subsidies to the poorest in France was sufficient to make them not go hungry month after month, there's also an important aspect of, if they continue to see the rich get richer and the inner city places doing great, while they're meagerly getting by.
Right.
That's a big factor as well.
Yeah, it's not just poverty. Obviously, like I said, and at the worst, at the far end of the scale, it's actually poverty or food insecurity, where you're not sure if you're going to be able to eat the next day. That's pretty bad. But for rich countries, or formerly rich countries that had a rich middle class, let's say,
Right.
When those people start to question whether or not they can go on holiday
like they used to
every year, well, that's enough. That's a big thing for people, so it's their lifestyle.
And they're being told, you got to take it. We've all got to take a hit.
Right.
They're hard times. All right, okay, we'll do it. And it's been, 11 years since the 2008 crash.
Right.
But in the meantime, the rich are just getting richer, and they can see examples of it.
Yeah.
So,
and it's maybe, you could say it's oversimplified, where people say, well, the rich people, the rich companies and billionaires and stuff aren't paying taxes, whereas we are. Our taxes are increasing. So that was a major thing for the Yellow Vests, the French protest, was that there were new taxes coming in.
Right. To save the planet.
On them. And at the same time, they were hearing about all these companies that were paying no taxes. And maybe a bit oversimplified. You may think that argument is oversimplified, but that's the argument. That's the way it looks to people.
No one has ideologically taught them to think that way.
Right.
They're responding to what they're seeing.
Just viscerally and on the basic details of the situation, and it's like you said, it's a sense of injustice or unfairness. So it's quite simplistic. That the motives that drive people to get out on the streets are often very simplistic, and you can blame people for being oversimplifying the situation, but at the same time, it's very real for them, because the bottom line is, despite all your economic theories and explanations, the bottom line is that if someone in France can't afford to go on holiday this year, then it doesn't matter to him or her what your economic theory behind that is. The bottom line is, I don't have enough money to go on holiday this year, and so I'm not happy, so I'm going to get out in the street and protest.
Yeah.
But the funny thing, going back to Venezuela, one thing that occurred to me that's kind of funny in a certain sense is that all of the, we've kind of swung back and forth on Trump over the past couple of years in terms of whether or not he was a kind of positive force to some extent.
Depends what mood he's in.
Depends what mood he's in. Depends what topic we're dealing with. We were generally kind of positive about his approach to Syria, the tack he took on that.
Do you know those troops aren't going anywhere now?
Well, there's only 400 or 500 of them, but
no, 400 or 500 US troops.
Yeah.
The remainder that were US troops will be replaced by French and British troops.
Well, yeah, whatever. It's over there anyway. It's done there anyway. But we would have complained to some extent about the so-called deep state or the establishment in the US kind of hamstringing Trump, attempting to stop him doing whatever he wanted to do. And we would have cited, the Russia investigation, Russia collusion, all that kind of nonsense as evidence of that. But it's interesting that, and part of that pushback against Trump was the left or the liberals, who all hate Trump, the never Trumpers, right?
The resistance.
Yeah. And we kind of would have been critical to some extent of them at certain points. But it's interesting now that I think Trump, in his swing towards a coup in Venezuela, is being hamstrung by the same forces. It's weird. The deep state, no doubt, is very happy and very, very much supportive of Trump's coup plans. That's probably their more than his. He's going along with it, but it's his and their attempts to initiate a coup in Venezuela. But it's coming back. The left in this sense is at least has the potential to do something good in their anti-Trump or never Trump activism, because you think that this is one area where they can get out in the streets. The left can get out in the streets and denounce him as an evil. All the things that they've said he is from since he was inaugurated. That he's an evil oligarch or an evil.
I've seen photos. About several dozen were out on the streets in New York yesterday.
Right,
dozens.
Yeah. It's sad. Yeah, I mean that you'd think in a normal world there would be every single Me Too anti-Trumper would be out in the streets and using this attempted coup in Venezuela as a way to bash him, as they have done for the past 2 years. But
Nope.
why not?
They're taking the cue from the media to support Trump on
Right,
this.
so the whole NPC,
Including Bernie Sanders.
The non-playable character thing is actually true. Then for a lot of these lefty types, they get what they take their orders from the media, from CNN basically, and the likes of CNN. If CNN supports the coup in Venezuela, then they, at the very least, are just mute about it. When it's a perfect opportunity for them to attack Trump. And CNN has been attacking Trump for 2 years, endlessly, and in every possible way. Why aren't they screaming bloody murder about Venezuela? Perfect opportunity to attack Trump, no? But that
ideal.
just points to the truth of what we're saying, is that the media and the deep state in the US have an agenda, and in this case in Venezuela, Trump's agenda and their agenda coincide, so they're fine.
Yeah,
They don't say a word about it.
it literally, the system literally does the thinking for about a third of people. That's the most eye-opening thing about it. These
Right.
people, you said it like it's like they take orders, but even that sounds to a military person takes an order, receives it, and then acts it out. These people just say it. The thought is downloaded, and it's just an immediate process. And one of their leaders, the socialist in quotes, Senator Sanders today, tweets, "The people of Venezuela are enduring a serious humanitarian crisis. The Maduro government must put the needs blah blah blah." He's basically, go with the coup.
Who did that, Bernie?
Bernie. That's the far left socialists who the deep state in quotes rigged the Democratic primary to prevent happening so that Hillary would be doing it. Hence, that's the reason actually why Trump won. Let's go with that. Let's assume Americans would have voted for Sanders over Trump, or could have.
Yep.
Well, he's there. He's with Trump on this.
Mm-hmm.
I think for the same reason that it's so transparently obvious to us what's going on here with trying to regime change Venezuela. It's the same reason, weirdly, that it's not at all obvious to a lot of people in the West in general, and especially in the United States. Okay, so and this isn't to defend Trump, but he's just signing the plan in motion, but really it's just the next step in a plan that goes back, obviously, probably to the George Bush years, certainly to the Obama years. I mean, plan regime change, Operation Regime Change in Venezuela predates Trump.
Right. Yeah.
Although he did come in swinging at it immediately when he was elected. That place is evil because of socialists. He's definitely culpable for helping facilitate the plan, so we can't absolve him of that.
No.
But it's years in the making. And
Right.
what I was going to say was that part of the reason why it's attracting a lot of people who probably might not otherwise be such NPCs in this situation and see through the BS is because of the amount of work that went into preparing the ground psychologically for this. Someone, a journalist called Aaron Gallagher, I think, did some pretty in-deep research following anti-Maduro, pro-regime change Twitter accounts, and found it's basically a huge botnet operation. The very thing that Russia was accused of doing to subvert the US elections, but in fact was just a tiny clickbait farm run out of St. Petersburg, had nothing to do with the elections whatsoever, really. She found an actual botnet type Twitter operation being run out of Miami. And it's 5 or 6 years old. Tens of thousands of fake accounts, but which drew in, it garnered enough of a thing going to draw in a lot of followers and actual people who were then becoming activated on its behalf. So what I'm getting at is this kind of, they did spend some time, some years, creating a cloud of confusion around Venezuela. I think that would partly explain why there's such a lag between the death of Chavez and the opportune moment to strike, which was now. It's been 5 years. And that was because, in part, at some level, the system realized it didn't have enough of attraction for people to have doubts, at least doubts. And this is, I think, part of the magic of creating reality as you want it to be. John Bolton actually said as much a month ago. We're trying to create the reality. I'm paraphrasing now, but the one that we hope that Venezuelan people will accept. Create enough confusion in the target country, but also in your own host country, and then globally as well, such that people are like, well, yeah, he does seem like a bit of a dictator. And I mean, the economy is doing really bad. And yeah, millions of people are leaving the country. So, you know, on this one, I think I'll just take a backseat, which is exactly actually what a lot of people who've been totally on board with so many issues in recent years, calling out the lies about Russiagate, calling out the anti-Trumpers and so on. From a lot of these people in the alternative media, there's been crickets the last month. They have nothing to say about Venezuela. But at least it's that. That's a bit more honest. They're not on the bandwagon with it. I think because they're like confused. Well, what is this? I know I hate socialism. And he's a socialist. Yeah, but who's saying it's a socialist dictator? It's the very same people who hate Trump. And they're taking a backseat or they're confused, because there is a lot of BS to work through, and it's about 5 years in the making. It's a very complex operation, but it's not so grand a conspiracy. It's more. It comes together naturally when you consider like the way these things happen. It's hybrid warfare. It's the very thing Russia's accused of doing. It's information, it's financial, and it's also there's nitty gritty to do. They had to get the Colombian government on board to basically create a Colombian government agency, something migration, the Spanish for migration, that had all the apparatus in place along the border to attract and then welcome and then give aid to Venezuelans who want to come over. That was part of an operation of beaming BS into Venezuela to convince them that their country was really, really, really bad, and they were doomed. It was going to fall. So they had all these things in place. And it is true that about 1 million people have left Venezuela in recent years. But it's interesting in the reports about it. If you do a search on how many Venezuelans, you will get anything from 1 to 5 or 6 million people already left as a fact. I found 2 conflicting UN reports that has a difference of a factor of about 1.5 million people. It's part of it's partly true that a lot of people have left, but there's this huge cloud of BS that's floating around, and they got some UN people on board with it. They got neighboring countries on board with it. It's quite an operation. And actually the guys at Blumenthal, I think working with Mint Press News, they had a couple of reports out this week. They've been doing some research on the connections between NGOs, Twitter campaigns, and efforts to tweak Venezuela's neighbors' migration policies to be unusually welcoming and giving incentives to Venezuelans to come on over these last several years, in fact. Maybe I'll throw it up on the screen so people can see it and search for themselves. It's the one by Mint Press News. You have that's it, Scott. Thanks. And one of the chief people they have at the center of it is Pierre Omidyar.
Guy who's up to his neck in Ukraine.
You wrote about him and his funding of NGOs in Ukraine, and he's central to this, and it goes back years. This is obviously he's former eBay billionaire or something.
Yeah,
and it's complex, and yet it all comes together naturally. He funds alternative media. He funds actual media networks. Twitter campaigns. He gets the right people, a bit like the way the British have their integrity initiative in Europe. They influence the neighboring countries to get the right people in to create like a welcome Venezuelan refugees agency dedicated to exactly that. And then there's the more hardcore stuff, of course. You probably leave him there. He's soft coup stuff, and then you get into CIA territory where the humanitarian aid shipments are packed with weapons and stuff. And the Venezuelans have been stopping shipments of weapons from Miami coming in recent weeks.
And Puerto Rico, yeah.
So it's I see why both sides. I see why, that's what I meant. It's why it's so transparently obvious to most people, and yet why it's also confusing. But this is the complexity of it these days.
Well, you look at that guy Pierre Omidyar as a businessman, a billionaire businessman, and you look at people like Richard Branson of Virgin Atlantic, Virgin Airlines, and on all the other stuff, who organised there a few days ago a Live Aid, effectively harking back to the kind of back in the 80s, the kind of pop or music festival designed to help starving people in Africa and Ethiopia. It was called Venezuela Live, I think, or something like that, and it was a concert held in Colombia just 2 days ago over the weekend, I think Friday night or Saturday night. What those guys, I mean, those guys aren't necessarily they're part of the kind of elite establishment, I suppose, from a business point of view, but, you know, those guys have to be kind of ideologically driven. They believe, you know, they're true believers in, they think that what they're doing is good for the Venezuelan people, you know. And, you know, you could say that to some extent the politicians have convinced themselves in Washington, and the CIA, even members of the CIA, have convinced themselves as well. But once you go further along that spectrum of the regime, into the murky areas of regime change, and the people who are actually overthrowing our governments and starting civil wars and stuff, I mean, there's a lot less scope for those people to believe that they're doing the right thing by the people of a certain country, because, you know, they're fairly sure that they're going to cause massive bloodshed, so they don't really care. But this guy like Pierre Omidyar and Richard Branson and stuff, they're just dupes. Like, I mean, and it's amazing to see some supposedly very intelligent people as, you know, as evidenced, I suppose, by their high-profile status in the business world and the amount of money that they've made, to see just how stupid they are, and how much they lie to themselves, and how much their scope for their lies to themselves, you know.
Well, I can explain Branson's interest. Branson cuts his teeth. I mean, makes his big money in the privatization of British Rail in the late 1980s. Virgin Trains. That's where he got off to pretty much became a billionaire on the back of that. So they're defending the homeland as they see it, the way things should be over there. I think it's in part motivated so that it never comes back here.
Those people want business. They think
that's the last thing.
They're free market kind of capitalists, I suppose, where they believe that, you know, you let the markets decide, basically. You let in business, you let businessmen come in and come up with ingenious plans for developing a country, and that's how a country is going to ultimately prosper, by getting rid of government, getting rid of big government. Of course, they're happy to allow governments to facilitate coups and that kind of stuff, but only to let them in to snap up, and a kind of fire sale, snap up the state infrastructure in a given country. You know, so Branson probably has some pretensions to maybe having a virgin rail system in Venezuela or something like that.
For example. But it's a ruse, because they say they're against big government, but what happens is that you end up getting a confluence of interest that is privately run government,
right?
Corporatocracy, or corp gov, as I like to call it.
Where all of
they
their
are
profits.
the government. Oh, we hate big government.
Right.
No, you are the big government.
They want to be the government.
And you run it in the shadows. Right. You're accountable to no one. You take the profits, and then you piss off when the trains don't run.
Right, yeah.
And you say, well, that's the way the world works. And they will produce reports that are government reports about how healthy the British rail system is.
Right.
And you try telling that to the British people, the trains don't fucking arrive on time. But that's not healthy to them. Is how well a return did it get from my investors?
Right. Yeah.
And everything's A-okay. And then they wonder why there's mass protests on the streets.
Yeah. So it's self-interest, ultimately, spun through a narrative that they tell to themselves, you know, they're doing it for the good of the people, etc. So, yeah, it's a human condition, I suppose. It's behind a lot of these problems. And then you've got the evil aspect of the human condition in the form of CIA and different intelligences doing it for more nefarious reasons, I suppose. But
let's pull up one of them. Can we get that tweet from Mr. CIA himself, Mike Pompeo? This is his tweet, along with the iconic optics they were going for yesterday.
We denounce Maduro's refusal to let humanitarian assistance reach Venezuela. What kind of a sick tyrant stops food from getting to hungry people? The images of burning trucks filled with aid are sickening. I'm sickened. Or the barf icon afterwards. No, he should have had a barf icon in there. Yeah, well, that's pretty sad.
The scary thing is how many people liked and retweeted that. But
yeah.
But that's now you're going from Omidar's territory into, okay, over to you now, boys, because you get to reap the emotional outpouring in theory. And now the something must be done message starts coming on. And now the CIA steps in.
Well, he says the images of burning trucks filled with aid are sickening. Yeah. So you got a truck down there and you set it on fire. Yeah. What's your point, you know?
And the truck is on, that's not, the bridge, the border isn't exactly there. The perimeter, the Venezuelans are right up at the top of the screen. That's still inside Colombia. Right. So that's why they went with the ridiculous thing about tear gas being fired over to set it on fire.
But this is Saddam's weapons of mass destruction. It is Gaddafi bombing his own people. The images of Gaddafi bombing his own people are sickening. And the images of Assad gassing his own people are also sickening. All of these things sicken me.
As they should sicken you.
And the fact is, but the person who's saying that's sickening had a major hand in creating that image. He himself.
He's basically part of the people who actually created it. It's a total setup.
Well, there's also the aspect in terms of Venezuela and creating this situation. I mean, back in 1973, when the US was behind the coup in Chile, and the US actually, if the US is able to carry off this coup in Venezuela, it'll be the 68th official coup around the world that the US has perpetrated.
No, just in Latin America, I think.
No, we're not 68 in Latin America, I don't think, is it?
I think because it's over and over again going back.
Well, anyway, the number was 68, but it'll be 68 times that they've done this, and it's the process of creating that, like back in 1973 in Chile, when John Bolton's predecessor, effectively the same kind of character as John Bolton, Henry Kissinger at the time, talked about making the process of creating the coup in Chile was to make the Chilean economy scream. And obviously that's kind of that's the process they've been following in Venezuela as well, through all sorts of sanctions for quite a long time now, sanctions against Venezuela. For example, there's a situation right now where there are sanctions against anybody that the US has just recently imposed against anybody buying Venezuelan oil. While the US itself buys Venezuelan oil, nobody else is allowed to buy Venezuelan oil. And India, for example, is being forced, because of sanctions on purchasing oil from Venezuela and Iran, India is being forced to buy oil from America. That's one net benefit right there, you know, where you actually create. I mean, it's like a mafia boss where basically.
I wonder if that oil has actually come from Venezuela.
Because it may well be.
Since in the last month, remember we saw that yesterday?
Yeah.
U.S. purchases of Venezuelan oil is up 5-fold.
Right. Yeah. So we're buying it.
So they're taking it out. But this is sanctioned, so you get it from us at a better price, higher price.
Right. Yeah. So it's a mafia operation, really, where you're just shutting down your opposition and forcing people to buy from you instead of buy from them.
The thing is, there is a culture in the United States where they literally see it as theirs. A Monroe Doctrine, you know, it's Latin America. This is our resource
our backyard.
To do with as we. So, God damn it, these socialists, no, it's ours.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why in the olden times, like in those earlier coups in the 20th century, they were always framed in the context of, we must intervene to kick out that socialist dictator because he's getting his orders from Moscow. Mm-hmm. Moscow's encroaching on our territory.
Right. We'll speak.
And they can't do that so much now because there isn't the same. So they're having to go with this humanitarian stuff to the hilt.
They haven't said it, but speaking of Moscow encroaching on our territory, there's a link, there's an article there from 2017 from the BBC, no less, from 18th of December 2017. There it is, Russia's Rosneft wins gas licenses in Venezuela. That's just a little over a year ago. Venezuela awarded license to Russian energy giant Rosneft to develop 2 offshore gas fields in the Caribbean Sea for the next 30 years. So that's just one example, and there have been other deals struck by Russia. I mean, Russia and Venezuela have a fairly long history of being, supporting each other. Primarily, Russia supporting each other, with Russia supporting Venezuela. And there have been other deals that have been struck in terms of different kinds of minerals, mineral extraction in Venezuela. Now, this would be something that would be a major red flag for the for the geopoliticians in Washington, basically, that
they're also
see Russia
purchasing of Russian military equipment as well.
Yeah,
the Chinese are invested pretty heavily too.
So while they haven't been saying it publicly, there is behind this Venezuela coup attempt, there is a major aspect of
geopolitics,
Russia interfering in our backyard.
Yeah,
and it's ultimately then like everything that happens, more or less, and every major event that happens in the world stage these days, and certainly for quite a long time actually, ultimately resolves to the kind of great game, a global game between for that America is involved in an effort to remain top of the heap, or to maintain its global hegemony as it sees it, that has been progressively being chipped away at by primarily Russia and China. So they're pushing back against that. In
the last month, Bolton also told Nicaragua and Cuba, we're coming after you too. I wonder about Nicaragua, because there you have, of course, the government that they created such bloodshed over in the 1980s to prevent from happening. Well, reality eventually said, no, you lose. They have the very Sandinista governments, although it's massively watered down since then. In Nicaragua right now, that government made... Well, they announced that they had made a deal with the Chinese. It has since gone quiet, so it's probably not in the works, but it was announced, and I think the announcement was interesting itself, that China would build an alternative canal through the isthmus connecting the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. It's viable. It's definitely viable, because in Nicaragua, there's like half of that distance would be covered by a huge lake. And so the excavation for a canal would not take much engineering-wise to do it. The Chinese have the money. Can you imagine if that was ever threatening to come to fruition? Basically a Chinese-controlled, in quotes, equivalent to the way the US has leverage over Panama.
This would be where? In Nicaragua?
Nicaragua.
Yeah.
And that would be basically curtains for US dominance of the Gulf. So I wonder if that's also not in the back of their minds.
Yeah.
Lock this down now, At the same time, as this is all going on, inadvertently, I suspect, I don't think anyone triggered this, Haiti blows up a few days after Trump declares that random guy named Guaido is the president.
Venezuela.
In Venezuela, Haiti blows up. Mass protests. I think something like 12 people have been killed. The security force just going nuts there. Although there was a report that unknown gunmen have been shooting at protesters. The protesters, by the way, have been waving Russian flags and calling for Russia to come intervene in Haiti. This is like, is that propaganda at work? Obviously, the Americans would see it that way. But think about it. This is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Are they educated enough, informed enough, have enough access to social media? Well, apparently they do have some access to internet to be able to go, damn this situation, get the Russians in here, because they hold them up to be a good exemplar of what a major power can do to help in an actual help, as opposed to American help and aid and assistance. That's just weird that how that blows up right there. And then their protest, they want the government out. It's basically what the US says is happening in Venezuela is actually happening in Haiti. It's the reverse. And then this is an example of the times, I suppose, whereas before it would have been a footnote in the history books that some researcher pulled out many decades later, within days of these protests erupting in Haiti. Did we pull up an article on this? I have something. Do we have something? I think I sent you something, Scotty, from the Miami Herald.
Nope.
We didn't. Never mind. Check it out. There was a report from Haiti picked up by the Miami Herald, so it's not denied by anyone, that they arrested snipers shooting at protesters in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince. They were arrested, filmed by someone from outside the station, filmed in the police station. They're all big, burly, mostly white, American-looking, let's say, gunmen. They were arrested and deported. They were also filmed by people in the airport chanting at them to get out of our country, basically. On their way to the plane. Someone on the plane also took out a phone and filmed these guys on the plane. So the old tactics, you can try them like you used to. Okay, situation is hot, send in the snipers, shoot both sides. But people see it happening. It's like people see it happening in real time, and they probably anticipate it happening as well, because everyone knows that this goes on now. This is why it's so much harder for the US to get away with this. It's not denied. The Miami Herald reported the facts as Haitian media reported it. They're brought back to the US, and the only place where we don't have any video evidence of who they are or what happened to them since is in the United States, because now they disappear and everyone agrees not to ask any questions once they're back on safe territory. So that's almost certainly in fact, one of the guys did give a quote, maybe to the Miami Herald reporter, in which he said that they were there at the behest of a private company, he wouldn't name it, of course, a private American company, presumably, to... Federal sources told the Miami Herald that the men will not be charged criminally, but are being debriefed. They told U.S. authorities that they were on the island providing private security for a, quote, businessman doing work for the Haitian government. 5 of them were U.S. citizens, of a group of about 12, I think. So that's just incredible. You know, the situation flares up, and within days, you got the snipers. And within hours, I think, of that happening, you've got the uncovering of it, the unveiling of it. They're not going to get away with the secrecy of it. And 5 years ago in Ukraine, it took a while, a few days at least. People weren't sure what the hell was happening. It was successful enough that it caused the coup. Yanukovych fled because he was being accused of ordering the police to shoot at protesters. Ukrainian people were outraged that protesters had been shot and killed. Then there was a leak from I think it was some Estonian envoy had been speaking on the phone to then Foreign Minister for Europe, Ashcroft. The Russians, I presume, leaked that phone conversation in which they are heard expressing, we don't know who these gunmen were, which completely contravened the media story that it was Yanukovych firing on the protesters. But after that, well, it takes some quiet media reports, a documentary by Oliver Stone, and then later, it was only last year that we finally found out who they were. They were Georgian mercenaries hired to come in and do that. So the whole thing did come out. Everyone kind of knew it at the time, but they still had success in making the coup happen. And then it took 5 years for it to really be known. Here, it's taken 5 freaking days. It's gone. Like, you can't do that again pretty much after that. And that speaks to the whole futility of the regime changes. What will we do? We'll just dust off the old playbook and do it again. What do? They hire Elliot freaking Abrams, who everyone has spent the last month digging up the dirt on, which isn't hard to do because he's all over Wikipedia. He was in Congress basically admitting that, yes, he was doing things like sending humanitarian aid convoys into Nicaragua with boatloads of weapons stored in the back. Everyone knew that was going to happen. The Venezuelan government shut down the borders, some of them anyway, border access points to Colombia, a week ago in anticipation of this. They knew what was going to happen. The Russian government announced 24 hours before yesterday's border skirmish. We should probably get this one up, actually. This is an RT report from the 22nd. US-run border provocation. This is it, yeah. They published that 36 hours before it happened. scroll down there. The Russian government, through their foreign ministry spokeswoman, Zakharova, said what was about to happen. Humanitarian aid was going to come. They would provoke a situation in which there would be clashes on the border. And, of course, the Russians then warned that could provide the opening for more hardcore action to come in and unseat Maduro. But they gave more specific details. Towards the end there, separately, the US is preparing a sizable weapons shipment for the Venezuelan opposition. The armaments, likely to be purchased in an Eastern European country, are large caliber machine guns, grenade launchers, assault rifles, and man-portable anti-aircraft rocket systems. Zakharova specifically said the cargo is set to arrive in Venezuela in early March through a neighbouring country on aircraft flown by an international shipping company. She can't know all these details. You can't speculate that. She's saying we know exactly how because we can see it in real time. So we can tell you a week or 2 weeks ahead of time what's going to happen. Yeah. This is the important thing. The element of surprise is key in a brutal type send the army in coup, and even today in a hybrid type use a bit of everything coup. The surprise is key. The population has to be caught unawares. But when governments can say this, and really that's not news to people, when the people in the country are aware that these kinds of things happen, it's not going to work.
Yeah, in Venezuela they're going to need some kind of a major outbreak of violence perpetrated by, agents of the US or agents of the opposition / the US. They're going to have to try, and the only way they could achieve what they want to achieve, I think, is by igniting some kind of a civil war, getting a large number of people into Venezuela with weapons and to start shooting and killing people.
Yeah,
that's the only way it can happen at this point.
Which would be like a rerun of Syria.
Yeah, pretty much, like to flood the country to some extent with mercenaries, with hired guns, basically, who want to wage a war against the Venezuelan military.
Yeah,
but that would take a lot of logistics.
I fear that they have the human resources to do it, because that roughly third of Venezuelans who are predominantly from the middle, they don't really have a middle, but middle upper white, they would wave the American flag. They're ideologically, ripe for that. I fear they have the numbers to cause some serious.
Maybe. I don't think people within the country though would necessarily. Those people are too well fed and well bred, let's say, to take up weapons and do it. They need to get some kind of a mercenary army, like you were saying. They used in Syria to do it. Foreign forces, And
it would have to come through Colombia. The Colombian government is up to its neck in this. Maduro broke off diplomatic relations with Colombia yesterday. Told diplomatic staff to clear out. We'll see if that's what he said to the US as well a month ago, but then he kind of backed down a bit. Interestingly, the Lima group, remember that? That was this part of the hybrid thing and years of preparation. It took several years ago they created this group. Lima group, forget the name Lima, that's obviously a reference to Peru. It was born in Canada. And what it is essentially they set up, because the Organization of American States, the OAS, wasn't getting them the votes they needed at their interregional meetings. They created a parallel structure and as many countries as possible. And then they said, we just passed a vote. Maduro's a dictator and we're going in. This is exactly what they accuse Maduro of doing, of setting up an alternative parliament. No, you can't do that. That's against constitutional and democratic norms. It's precisely what they've been doing. They're due to meet in Bogota, Colombia, tomorrow, where apparently a random guy named Guaido is to meet Pence. The horrifying thing about this, I think for me, is that the US can't back down. There's no way out of. How do you come back from this without going the whole hog? Last week we saw probably another horrible indicator of what's to come. Basically, someone blew up a pipeline in Venezuela. The next possible out for Venezuelans, whether or not this escalates in the coming months, is the 2020 elections in the US. But even then, that's so what? So someone not Trump comes in, that would need to be someone not Trump and someone who would nix the CIA's Plan Venezuela. So that's extremely unlikely. The only other things I can think of is a physical deterrent imposed by Russia / China / allies like Iran or whoever. That has only happened once in history, in modern history, which is Crimea 5 years ago, when Russia physically put its foot down and said, you're not taking that. And that's because the situation was critical for Russia. Is Russia going to... We know they sent bombers as a signal in December, but are they going to do anything more than that?
The Russian government is confident that
Venezuela can hold out.
Right, that they can maintain stability, basically. That's what they've said anyway, so we'll have to wait and see. But I just want to move on to, just briefly, before we wrap up, the Yellow Vests and something that's happened around the Yellow Vest protests. As people who've been listening and watching the show know, Yellow Vest protests in France are just a popular protest movement that's been going on for 15 consecutive weeks, and now mostly on the weekends, on Saturdays, with mass demonstrations and a bit of rioting, lots of tear gas, a lot of people being injured, some people being killed in France. Initially, the government, the French government, half-heartedly attempted to appease them by giving them basically nothing, dressed up as something. The people rejected that and said, stick it, and they kept protesting. So then the Macron government, obviously not interested in actually, giving anything to the people or giving up any of its power or doing away with or stopping any of the corruption that the protesters are complaining about, initially decided to defame them, basically defame the protesters in the media, which is, propaganda war is a big part of any war, and it's a war between the Macron government and a lot of the French people. So the Macron government has initially decided to call them basically far-right extremists, Nazi types in there. Then when that was just laughed off, then they said that they're obviously, the next one would have been that they're Russian agents. They tried the Russian agents. Russia is somehow influencing these protests. That was laughed off even louder. And then most recently, they've brought out the big guns of saying that that they're anti-Semites, that the Yellow Vest protest movement has been taken over by anti-Semites. There's anti-Semites behind every single Yellow Vest. There's an actual article from The Guardian here, which is, The Guardian, you'd think, of being a historically leftist UK newspaper, would be behind this kind of a popular protest against corruption in government and for civil rights and that kind of thing. But
or at least reasonably neutral.
Yeah, but The Guardian, just a couple of days ago, France has an anti-Semitism problem, and not just from the Gilets jaunes. So they've gone... They don't just say the Gilets jaunes are a bunch of anti-Semites. They say, well, France itself has a problem with anti-Semitism going back a long time. So this article that I'm referring to here just, it's just complete and utter horseshit. Like, I mean, as the anti-Semitic trope that is used so often and has been used so often in many different areas, particularly in the West, it's just complete nonsense. I mean, even in this article, I mean, this person who wrote it even said that, refers to, hateful slogans on banners and anti-Semitic graffiti sprayed on walls, and the groups of Gilets jaunes shouting abuse and making the Canel gesture, and in quotes, that's explained as an inverted Nazi salute.
Which is what the French government wants everyone to think it is.
But it's ridiculous that a supposed journalist would not even have done a cursory amount of investigation to realise that the Canel is not an inverted Nazi salute. It's ridiculous. Somebody decided to call it that. Somebody in government decided to call it that. It's
Manuel Valls did.
Yeah. And out of whole cloth. It has nothing to do with Nazism at all. Canel is actually a it's a savoury, it's like a stuffed bread
Pastry.
pudding type thing, and it's about, some of them are the length of your arm basically, and it's, it's a rude gesture to say up yours basically. It's like saying, it's like the opposite, it's like up yours, right? But that's been turned into, it's a Nazi salute. So anybody making that salute now is an anti-Semite. Except when the person doing it is saying to the government, screw the corrupt, whatever. But now they're Nazis and anti-Semites. Anyway, so
that whole succession of events last week was
it was ridiculous.
Crazy.
Macron decided he doubled down. Not only are the Gilets Jaunes now all discredited as anti-Semites, but Macron is toying with passing a new law that will make increase or expand the definition of anti-Semitism to include any criticism of Israel.
Yeah.
What?
Anti-Zionism.
And Zionism.
Isn't it a bizarre...
What's his agenda like?
I know, it's so weird. Like, maybe this will help us. The day before he went to speak at the CRIF, C-O-R-I-F, which is basically like France's APAC. He was scheduled to speak there. The day before, the head of the CRIF had a big spread interview in Le Monde, in which he called for drastic measures to end the demonstrations.
Right. Drastic measures. This is a drastic measure.
Early next morning,
call them anti-Semites.
Early next morning, someone goes to a Jewish cemetery in Strasbourg.
Someone
sprays swastikas all over it. Macron gets his whole team out on a train to Strasbourg. Photo ops later that morning. Isn't it terrible? Isn't it terrible? Goes back to Paris for apparently a previously unscheduled visit to the Holocaust Museum in Paris.
Right.
On he goes then to the CRIF and gives a speech in which he declares what the head of CRIF wanted in Le Monde the day before, drastic measures to end the demonstrations, by declaring he's going to expand the definition. I mean,
why would a Jewish organization want the Yellow Vest movement to stop? What's that got to do with the Jewish organization protesting France?
Here's the logical thing that they don't want to say, but they're screaming themselves. They're saying Jews as a whole, I don't know what,
support the French government,
are the
part
government,
of the establishment,
a key part, if not the establishment. Therefore, y'all in your insurrection upwards are anti-us who are up here looking down on you. Therefore, we see what you're doing, all of you, 60 million French people, you're being anti-Semitic.
Right.
That's what they're saying between the lines. Yes, the conspiracy theory of the last 150 years is true. The Jews rule over you, ergo your insurrection is anti-us. I mean, that's not even actually technically correct. There is evidence for it in some respect, but it's not actually true. But they're making the worst of the conspiracy theory true, such that imagine, just see down the road what the next horrifying steps are. If they keep on with this and bash people, no, you're being against government policy on X means you're being anti-Semitic. You're going to condition people to see the Jews as the problem.
Right.
Not just a problem, as the problem that requires the solution. It's horrifying. It's a total solution from government that's going to create a total reaction. And we know what happened in history with that in Western Europe.
Yeah. It's bizarre.
It's a horrible trap to walk Jews into.
Yeah. Well, they're doing exactly the same thing, and it's a horrible trap for Jews to walk themselves into, because the vast majority of them are supportive of it. At least they're public figures and stuff.
Absolutely.
You know?
I mean,
and
there are yellow vesters wearing they're making a point of wearing the
kippah.
What do they call it? The kippah, and donning the yellow vest. I mean, it's such a...
They're doing exactly the same thing, have been for several years, to Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, this is at the same time. That's coming to a head at the sort of big time at the same time.
Accusing him of being anti-Semitic and the Labour Party under him of rampant anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which is complete and utter nonsense, even by stats produced by Jewish organisations in the UK themselves, that anti-Semitism is far less than it was under the previous Labour Party leader. But the media just repeats this over and over again, like we saw in the Guardian there. It's bizarre, and I don't understand. It blows my mind how it's a trope, of anti-Semitism can has been just used and abused over and over again for so long, and it keeps going. It's not diminishing. Anytime you want to demonize a group, or let's say the Jewish lobby in any country wants to demonize a group, they simply accuse them of being anti-Semitic. It's like, it's almost like calling someone a paedophile, Once the claim is made, then it sticks. You're the worst possible human being in the world. It's ridiculous. Yeah. It's like, just I don't understand it really. I don't understand the utility of it, but why they would do it, why they would go there and, like you said, provoke that kind of reaction, because people really don't like being accused of something that being accused of being the most despicable human being when they're not at all. Yeah. When what they're actually demanding, what the yellow vests are protesting about, are decent, reasonable. They're protesting for honourable values, let's say, and to be responded to by saying you're a despicable human being and here's a label to go along with that is just like...
And then to be threatened with legal consequences. Yeah. Prison terms for being a yellow vester, anti-Semite. The two will be used synonymously or juxtaposed as the needs demand. Mm-hmm. Because it's already illegal in France to do the canal, which was a humorous gesture. It was a way of slacking off the government or other elite figures, media figures. They made that illegal. When you're starting to ban humor, like the way they want to ban memes and all this stuff, right? It's just a downward slope. This is pathocracy 101.
Well, that's because humor is traditionally a way to convey truths. It's funny because it's true, and when you outlaw, you're effectively outlawing the popular expression of a truth. Well, then, you're already in a totalitarian scenario, where you're outlawing the spoken truth, basically. But it's just, it can only get worse from here. The overall state of affairs here seems to be an entrenched Western kind of high-level elite, and I'm not just talking about people like Macron and government puppet figures, but people behind them who over the past 20, 30, 40, 50 years have really consolidated their power and their corruption, and they're wielding it to the full extent, and they're in no mood to let any of it go, to release even a tiny amount. And as they consolidate themselves in their power and corruption, and as they exercise it more and more, they're going to get more and more people protesting and speaking out against them, which will, of course, cause them to crack down even further. It's nobody should be surprised that within a few years or a small number of years that we end up in a kind of a dystopian totalitarian nightmare scenario, in not maybe across the board, but certainly in pockets, in areas flaring up in different places at an increasing rate, Because that's the way it's going. That's the way the winds are blowing right now. If you look objectively at what's happening, that's what's happening, You have this group of people in power who are doubling down on their power and their corruption. And
they're so blind that they can't see that just yielding a bit would be in their self-interest.
Right.
Nope.
Yeah.
Nope.
Pathology, it's called. Anyway, I think we'll leave it there for this week, folks. I think we covered the major topics. There's a lot more going on, I suppose, but I think those are the two major things that are at least in the news, have been in the news over the past week or two. We'll keep watching, and we'll be back with another show next week. If you like this video, please subscribe and click the notification icon and like and all that good stuff. So until next week, or until next time, have a good day.
See you soon. Bye, everyone.